Welcome to your first week of instructional strategies. Because of your great work on the Procyon fiber task analysis, you're ready to move on. Before we do that, let's look at what your teamwork uncovered. The subject matter expert in this scenario was fairly typical of a subject matter expert. She's an expert who clearly understands the process, but she does not know how to explain it to somebody who is a novice. You were able to identify facts and concepts, such as safe and unsafe procedures when dyeing and using chemicals. You were able to identify principles, which were the relationship between dye and water and color intensity. You were able to identify procedures, as in the procedures for the dye bath, and you were able to identify attitudes, such as an appreciation of the aesthetic of intense colors. You identified many points of potential confusion as well, including the instruction that mentioned 2 pastes. This was really confusing because the second paste was made from the first paste, and it was difficult to know which paste was being referenced. One group came up with a clever suggestion that I think would work well. Simply change references to the second paste and call it thickened dye. There were also 2 processes for pre-treating the fabric, and it was not clear when to use one over the other. One person in the class had dyeing experience and pointed out the dye bath required agitation, stirring, every 15 minutes to evenly distribute the dye. Now that you have identified the tasks and their content classifications, you're ready to work on instructional strategies. Let's take a look at how Dr. Mabel Kinsey describes instructional strategies.
Hello, instructional designers. This video is about instructional strategies and how you can employ learning theory and your own natural creativity to develop the very best ones. So here are some suggestions to help spur your strategy development. After you've articulated your objectives and content structures, you identify relevant learning theories and use them to develop design guidelines. I'll provide you some suggestions in just a moment. Then, drawing from those design guidelines, brainstorm instructional strategies and decide on strategies that will both provide initial or follow-up presentations of relevant content and offer generative learning experiences. I'd like to begin the process by giving you some examples of design guidelines that I've developed and I use quite frequently on the basis of a collection of learning theories. The first and most favorite collection of learning theories, the ones that I use most often, my go-to theories, are anchored instruction, situated learning, and social constructivism. On the basis of these 3 theories, I have 2 design guidelines that I can offer you, so feel free to appropriate them if they fit. Authentic context works to anchor learning and to suggest the tools of learning, and individuals working together to develop understandings and skills. So to the extent that my instruction can embody those things, it will be much more powerful. Another popular theory is cognitive apprenticeship. As I apply this apprenticeship to design, it means I would have an expert modeling desired performance and gradually fading that performance over time as the learner is engaged in problem solving. And I could also apply that to peer leading and peer mentoring, again, fading that during problem solving over time. When I apply cognitive flexibility theory to strategy development, I have a couple of guidelines that emerge. First, the focus needs to be on knowledge construction, not delivery of content. And multiple representations are useful, possibly in a nonlinear format to encourage that cognitive flexibility. On to the next constellation of theories, multiple modalities, management of cognitive load, and employing minimalism. The guidelines emerging from those 3 theories: modalities selectively chosen for learning, supporting each other, and not adding to the cognitive load. To focus cognition meaningfully and offload unimportant tasks. In other words, to minimize memorization. And to include all necessary information, limiting passive activity and allowing for error recovery with very little penalty. Finally, cognitive dissonance, many of you might be familiar with, presenting situations that may contradict students' previous understandings as a way of provoking engagement at the beginning of an instructional event. Those are some of my favorite theories and the design guidelines that I've abstracted from each one. Now let me walk you through a couple of examples. The first example involves concept knowledge development, and I've adapted this example from a project done for Montpelier called My Life, Your Life. It's actually produced by 3 instructional design students at Curry, Laura Lewis, Will Davis, and Sherry Gosby. The goal for this project: students will describe the implications of slavery and what it meant to be a slave in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Students will compare their lives with those of people living in times of slavery. There were 5 objectives developed, and for this example, let's focus on Objective 2. Students will describe the different people on the plantation and their roles in the plantation community. It's a pretty simple task analysis for this objective. First of all, define the roles of slaves on a plantation. And there's a little bit of factual information supporting it. There were farm laborers, domestic servants, and artisans and blacksmiths. And also defining the role of the plantation owner, who oversees all plantation affairs. And the task analysis actually goes further and identifies the role of the plantation foreman. So if we stopped here and simply provided this information, maybe incorporated some practice in which they would write something up about the roles of these various people, it would be pretty dull and not very effective. So let's apply some learning theory. The design team selected anchored instruction and social constructivism, and the design guidelines: authentic context anchors the learning and suggests the tools of learning, and individuals working together to socially construct their understandings and skills. For the instructional strategies then, for generative learning, they employed discovery pouches. The students were anthropologists, discovering and interpreting the pouch's contents, which were authentic artifacts. When students received the pouches, they weren't labeled, but had been developed for the roles of plantation owner, foreman, and a household slave, a laborer, and a blacksmith. These were based on historical records of individuals who had been slaves and the likely contents of pouches that they might have owned. When teams of students received their pouch, they unpacked it, examining each item and interpreting what that item might have been used for, and what did that collection of items mean about the life experience of the individual that possessed them. The design team elected to begin with the generative activities rather than information presentation, capturing their interest, their engagement, their attention, their involvement, and alerting the students to what additional information they might need to know about. So you can see there was significant evolution from the task analysis through application of theory to the strategy development. And one of my favorite parts of this project involved students examining their own backpacks and purses and making interpretations about their own life ways and comparing and contrasting against those of the individuals they'd considered at Montpelier. One more example, this time of a psychomotor procedure, the improvised chair litter. It's useful for carrying an injured person up and down stairs and through narrow, winding passageways. Here are the steps in the procedure. I won't read through them. Feel free to pause the video if you'd like to examine them in a little more detail. So here are some ways that learning theories can be applied to strategies for this particular learning need. For initial presentation of content, dual coding is useful, employing illustrations or video along with corresponding text or narration. Information processing theory suggests we target 7 primary steps for any to-be-learned procedure, and in that way we meet the capacity of short-term memory. With a minimalist approach, we might employ a just-in-time job aid that would be a one-pager with illustration and main points on one page. But not all ideas generated at this point are practical. A one-page job aid is designed to be placed at the location at which it would be used. How would you know in advance where to place a job aid for a chair litter evacuation? To help inform generative learning activities, situated learning theory might be applied, with learners experiencing the right way and wrong way to perform the chair litter evacuation in a crisis role play, first as a rescuer with injured actors, and then as a patient being evacuated in the time of crisis. And as a function of this, being able to describe the implications for the patient and the rescuers. And in the spirit of creative brainstorming, let's consider constructivist learning theory. An application of that might be learners discovering techniques for evacuation. With no information given, a performance coach might provide feedback following each attempt. Perhaps not the most efficient way to develop those particular skills, but certainly memorable ones. In this application, additional practice settings might be provided with feedback faded over time, causing performance to be transferred to new applications and to further deepen learners' transferability. So while task analysis is undeniably important for understanding what's involved in your learning objectives, don't stop there. Think creatively about instructional strategies and use learning theory to help kickstart your creative brainstorming process.